It is the summer of 1955, and somewhere beneath the hills surrounding Seattle, Washington, men are digging, not for gold, not for oil, for survival, for the possibility that the city of Seattle, with its shipyards, its aircraft factories, its quiet suburban streets, might one day cease to exist in a single blinding flash lasting less than a second. What if the greatest secret military network ever built on American soil was not buried in the Nevada desert or hidden beneath some classified federal compound, but instead threaded invisibly through the forests and hilltops of the Pacific Northwest, just miles from where ordinary families were driving their children to school? What if those same families, buying groceries and watching television and mowing their lawns on a Saturday afternoon, had absolutely no idea they were living in the shadow of nuclear-tipped missiles pointed at the sky? This is not a hypothetical. This happened. And for nearly 70 years, most of what was buried inside those hills, inside those reinforced concrete bunkers, inside those carefully unmarked chain-link fences, was never fully explained to the public. In 2026, a new tranche of declassified Army documents emerged from the National Archives, and what they contained rewrote the timeline of how close Seattle came to becoming a target, and how desperately the United States government scrambled to build a ring of nuclear fire around one of the most strategically vital industrial cities on the entire West Coast. Those documents contained something the public had never been allowed to see in full. The true purpose of the missiles was not just to intercept Soviet bombers, it was to protect two things above all else: Boeing, and a small technology research campus that would one day become Microsoft. The stakes, it turned out, were not just military, they were civilizational. To understand what was built around Seattle, you first have to understand the fear that built it. By 1950, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, years ahead of schedule. American military planners, who had assumed a decade of nuclear monopoly, suddenly found themselves staring at a strategic nightmare. The Soviet long-range bomber force, equipped with the Tu-4 and later the Tu-95, had the theoretical range to reach the continental United States by flying over the Arctic. The targets would not be military bases alone. They would be industrial cities, cities that produced aircraft, cities that built engines and processors and electronic systems that kept American military power operational. Seattle, which at that point was responsible for producing a significant portion of all military aircraft in the Western Hemisphere, was ranked among the highest priority Soviet targets in any classified nuclear strike scenario. The response was a program called the Nike Missile Defense System. What began as a concept sketched by Bell Laboratories engineers in the late 1940s became, within just a few years, one of the largest peacetime military construction projects in American history. Across the country, the Army Corps of Engineers began site selection surveys in every major metropolitan area: Boston, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle. The plan called for a ring of missile launch sites, each positioned at a precise distance and angle from the city center to create overlapping fields of coverage. Each site would be paired with a separate radar installation, connected by buried communication cables, staffed around the clock, and capable of launching nuclear-armed missiles within minutes of receiving an alert. By the time the program reached full operational capacity in the late 1950s, more than 200 Nike missile sites had been constructed across the continental United States. Seattle received 12 sites, arranged in a rough arc stretching from Redmond in the east to Vashon Island in the west, from the northern suburbs near Shoreline to the southernmost ridge lines overlooking Tacoma. The Army did not announce these sites in public press releases. It did not hold town hall meetings. It did not ask permission from the communities whose hilltops it quietly requisitioned. The total construction cost, adjusted for inflation, exceeded what most American cities spent on their entire public infrastructure budgets for a decade. The secrecy was not simply bureaucratic habit, it was doctrine. The theory held that if the Soviet intelligence apparatus could map the precise location of every Nike site, their strike planners could design a bomber approach that threaded between the defensive gaps. Secrecy, quite literally, was the weapon. So the workers who poured the foundations in the winter of 1954 and 1955 told their families they were building communications relay stations. The truck drivers who hauled concrete down unmarked forest roads told their wives they were on a road grading contract for the county. The electrical engineers who ran conduit through freshly blasted hillsides told their neighbors it was for a new telephone switching facility. None of it was true. What they were actually building was a chain of underground fortresses designed to survive a near-miss nuclear detonation and continue launching missiles into the sky. Each Seattle Nike site followed the same basic design template, though the terrain forced improvisation at nearly every location. The launch area was always separated from the administration and radar area by at least a quarter mile, connected by roads wide enough for missile transport vehicles. The launch area contained three things buried deep below ground: an elevator magazine, capable of storing up to 12 missiles stacked horizontally, hydraulic lifts that could raise a fully assembled missile to the surface in under 4 minutes, and a set of reinforced blast doors rated to withstand overpressure levels that would have flattened a standard concrete building. Above ground, the only visible features were the launch rails themselves, the fire control radar dishes mounted on steel towers, and a cluster of low-profile administrative buildings that, from the road, looked indistinguishable from a rural industrial facility. The camouflage was never theatrical. It relied on ordinariness. And ordinariness, it turned out, was the most impenetrable disguise of all. But there was a problem. The soldiers who lived and worked at these sites were not simply technicians standing by a telephone. They were young men, most of them between 18 and 22 years old, living in semi-permanent barracks inside a facility that the outside world had been told did not exist in the form it actually existed. Their daily routines were governed by a state of permanent readiness that had no real precedent in American military history. A Nike missile battery could be ordered to fire in under 4 minutes from the moment an alert condition was declared. That meant that at every hour of every day, including Christmas morning and the 4th of July, there were soldiers in the underground launch control rooms, whose job was to be ready to end the lives of every Soviet crew member aboard a bomber that might or might not be carrying a nuclear weapon toward the city behind them. The psychological weight of this assignment was something the Army Medical Corps studied quietly and did not publish broadly. Former crew members who later spoke to historians described a particular kind of dread that accumulated over months of service. Not the fear of combat, which at least contained movement and resolution, but the fear of a moment that might never come, or might come at any second, and that when it came would require them to act with total certainty in total darkness, based entirely on information fed to them through systems they were trained to trust absolutely. One former soldier stationed at the Redmond site described the underground launch room as feeling like a submarine that never moved. The hum of the ventilation systems, the soft light of the instrument panels, the complete absence of any natural sound. The missiles themselves evolved over the life of the program in ways that made the psychological burden heavier, not lighter. The original Nike Ajax used conventional high-explosive warheads, lethal, accurate, effective against a bomber at high altitude. But the Ajax had a weakness. It was designed to destroy a single aircraft. And Soviet strike doctrine, the Army planners feared, might involve not a single bomber, but a formation of dozens, flying in close formation specifically to overwhelm a battery that could only engage one target at a time. The solution to this problem was the Nike Hercules, and the Hercules carried something the Ajax did not: a nuclear warhead, a warhead with a yield of up to 40 kilotons, more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And the theory was that if a formation of Soviet bombers was too dense to pick off individually, you detonated a nuclear weapon in the middle of the formation at altitude above the city you were defending, and accepted that the electromagnetic pulse and thermal effects at ground level were an acceptable cost compared to allowing the formation to reach its target. What they discovered next was even more disturbing. The rules of engagement for deploying a nuclear Nike warhead were, by modern standards, astonishingly loose. Authorization did not require the President. It did not require the Secretary of Defense. In certain classified escalation scenarios that were only partially declassified decades later, local battery commanders had pre-delegated authority to arm and fire a nuclear Hercules if communications with higher command were disrupted and incoming tracks met specific threshold criteria. A young captain in a concrete room under a hill in Redmond, Washington, could, in theory, and within the legal frameworks of the time, have detonated a nuclear weapon over the suburbs of Seattle without a direct order from anyone above the rank of colonel. This was not an accident of bureaucratic oversight. It was a deliberate design choice, built on the assumption that a Soviet first strike would destroy command and control infrastructure before local commanders could receive guidance. Records tell a different story about public awareness than the Army officially maintained. Declassified correspondence between local elected officials and Army installation commanders in the late 1950s shows that city council members in several Seattle suburbs were asking pointed questions about the large fenced installations that had appeared on hilltops they had previously designated for public park use. The Army's replies were consistent, bureaucratically polite, and almost entirely dishonest. The facilities were described as communications research installations supporting regional air defense coordination. The word missile appeared in none of the official correspondence. The word nuclear appeared in none of it either. In at least 3 cases, Army public affairs officers arranged briefings for local officials that included scale models and technical charts describing the facilities as purely passive detection and coordination centers. The missile magazines beneath their feet were not mentioned. What happened after 1945 is a story unto itself, but what happened after 1974 is where the mystery deepens into something stranger. The Nike program was officially terminated in the mid-1970s as intercontinental ballistic missiles made the Soviet bomber threat obsolete and satellite-based early warning systems replaced the need for ground-based radar rings. The Army began the process of decommissioning all 12 Seattle sites within a matter of months. But decommissioning, it turned out, was not a clean or complete process. Several sites were transferred to county governments and converted into parks and public facilities. The Redmond site became part of a golf course and nature preserve. Portions of the Vashon Island installation were absorbed into a county park, but the underground structures at these sites were not removed. They were sealed. The elevator magazines were filled with aggregate in some cases, left void in others, with the blast doors welded shut and the surface access points buried under new topsoil. At one site in the northern suburbs, a property survey conducted in 2019 by a regional utilities company discovered that the buried power conduits running to the facility were still energized. No agency claimed responsibility for the active power feed. An inquiry to the Army was met with a statement acknowledging that some infrastructure associated with former installations may not have been fully documented during decommissioning. Hikers using the trail system that now runs over the former Cougar Pass battery site have reported, over a period stretching from the late 1990s to as recently as 2022, a periodic low-frequency vibration emanating from a depression in the hillside, roughly consistent with the location of what old survey maps identify as the former underground magazine access point. The National Park Service, which maintains the trail, issued a statement in 2023, attributing the reports to seismic activity common to the region. Geologists who reviewed the reports independently noted that the frequency and rhythm described by witnesses was inconsistent with natural seismic signatures for the area. In 2021, a group of urban historians working with the University of Washington filed Freedom of Information requests seeking complete site remediation records for all 12 Seattle Nike installations. They received partial documentation for 9 sites. For the remaining 3, the Army response cited exemptions under provisions that typically apply to currently active facilities. The researchers filed an administrative appeal. As of the date of this recording, no response has been received. What the Nike missile ring around Seattle ultimately represents is not simply a chapter in Cold War military history, though it is certainly that. It represents something more unsettling about the relationship between democratic governments and the people they govern. 12 facilities containing nuclear weapons were constructed, staffed, and operated for nearly 2 decades within the daily living environment of a major American city. The people who raised their children in those suburbs, who built their businesses in those hills, who walked their dogs along those fences, were not informed. They were not consulted. They were managed. The decision to manage rather than inform was made by men who believed, perhaps sincerely, that the public could not be trusted with information that might cause panic or compromise operational security. And perhaps they were right, in the narrow tactical sense. The batteries were never compromised. The locations remained secure. The Soviet bombers never came. But the missiles are still down there, sealed in their concrete sleeves beneath the parks and golf courses and hiking trails where children play on summer afternoons. The warheads were removed. The fuel was drained. The official record says everything dangerous was properly disposed of. The official record, however, has already been demonstrated in at least 3 documented cases to be incomplete. We know about the 12 sites they told us about. We know about the ones that made it into the declassified files and the county property transfers and the environmental assessments. What we do not know, and what those 2026 documents hint at without fully revealing, is whether the ring around Seattle was the only ring, whether the defensive arc visible on the maps was the complete arc, whether there were, in the language of the era, supplementary installations designated for special purposes that were never folded into the public decommissioning record at all. Somewhere beneath a Pacific Northwest hillside, behind a welded blast door under 30 years of new growth, the answer may still be sitting in the dark, humming quietly to itself. If you want to know what other secrets are still buried under American cities, subscribe, because the next chapter goes somewhere even deeper.